Hello everybody, the next plane off the pile is a Stanley number 48 tongue and groove plane. Let's take a look at it. Now this might look just like any other old 48, but it's not, because this one's going to a veteran. The veteran's name is Darren, and he served in the Army in the early 2000s. And he has no idea that this plane is coming his way. Stanley made the number 48 from 1876 until 1942. These planes were Japanned before 1898. Then they went to nickel coating for all but the war production planes, and those are pretty rare. They were 10.5 inches long up until 1937, and then Stanley shortened them to 9 3/4 inches. This one was made before 1937 because it's 10.5 inches long. The plane cuts 5/16 of an inch wide tongue and groove match joints. It'll cut the tongue and groove on boards 3/4 of an inch wide up to as wide as 1 1/4 inch, and it centers on 7/8 of an inch. You switch from cutting the tongue to cutting the groove by rotating the fence 180 degrees. It originally came with 3 cutters. 2 of them were 5/16 of an inch wide, and the third one was 5/8. The 5/8 was used for cutting the wider boards. This plane only has the 2 5/16, and most of the tongue and groove planes I've seen are always missing at least one of the irons. It'll still cut the wide boards up to 1 1/4 inch, but you're going to have to take another plane or a chisel and remove the little bit of excess that the narrow blade didn't take off. This plane is nickel over cast iron, and it has a rosewood front knob. The nickel is worn thin, and I'd say it's probably about 80%. Before I break this old plane down, I want to show you the Union clone plane that's sitting right behind it. The Unions are quite uncommon. I think they were initially made by Stanley, and maybe this one was, I'm not sure. But as you can see, they're almost identical as far as the shape and all the parts. It's a good looking old plane. Time to break her down. And there's what she looks like all broken down. The parts I got to keep an eye on are those tiny little parts right there for the pivoting fence. That's the pin that held the fence in place, and it was sticking. It wasn't working free, but when I'm done it's going to work like new again. First thing I'm going to do is clean up that front knob with the sanding sponge. That sanding sponge has been around a while. If all I wanted to do was clean it up, I could get away with using this fine sanding sponge by doing some careful sanding, not going through the lacquer, but I'm planning on putting a couple fresh coats of lacquer on this, so it doesn't matter. And after the sanding sponge comes the 4/0 steel wool. I wanted to mention that this beautiful old plane, it's going to be a user, not a top shelf sitter, not part of somebody's fancy collection. So putting a fresh coat of lacquer on this front knob is just going to help to protect it for many more years to come. In addition to being an excellent finish, what lacquer does is, if there's any old lacquer on that knob, which there is, it melts into it. It just kind of, every successive coat, it doesn't just top coat the lacquer that's underneath, it actually penetrates the lacquer. First coat is always a very light mist coat. I'm going to follow that up with multiple coats, sanding in between the third and on the final coat. And while the lacquer coats build up and dry, I'm going to take this nickel coated parts, put them in my sandblaster, lower the pressure down to about 40 psi. Be very careful on the tip, keeping it back from the metal. Try to clean it up a little bit. With the blasting done, I'm moving on over to my wire wheel. And I do want to mention that once your nickel loss starts, it starts to flake off. There's not a whole lot you can do to prevent it. Try to get as much of the surface as I can lightly with the wire wheel. And what I can't get with this, I'm going to do by hand with a small wire brush, some steel wool. Try to buff the nickel or whatever's left back up. I've done all I could with the wire wheel, and now I'm going to move on to use the small wire brush and some 4/0 steel wool. Get into the nooks and crannies where the wire wheel wouldn't get. And keep in mind that I was not aggressive with that wire wheel. I was just kind of buffing up the nickel. And the nickel ended up looking better than what I thought it would. So the next thing I need to do is move on and take care of the small parts. I'm going to do that on my wire wheel. With the small parts all cleaned up, it's on to the iron. These two irons, also known as cutters, are going to clean up nice on my lapping station. I could have also used my sanding block with 150 grit paper or a fine sanding sponge, but today I'm just going to go to the lapping station so I can easily clean up both sides just like that. The edges, same way, and we'll take a look at them when they're done. And both cutters cleaned up really nice, and I flattened the back side, the leading edge where it cuts. Took it down to my 7,000 grit paper, so now it's ready for sharpening. I'm using my General number 810 chisel and plane iron sharpener to sharpen these cutters. And here's a trick you might not have seen before. I've had both cutters locked down inside my sharpener. That makes it easier for me to keep them square, and it goes a whole lot faster because I'm doing both at the same time. And as you can see, having both cutters in, it is a lot easier to keep this thing stable and have a nice square edge on the front. And these razor sharp cutters are ready to be put to work. And there's a quick look at the back side, looking really good. The only thing left for me to finish up is the front knob. I gave it about 4 coats of lacquer, hit it with a sanding sponge and steel wool, gave it another 3 coats. Now it's time for the sanding sponge, steel wool, and a coat of wax, and that beautiful old knob will be done. And wax on, wax off, the knob's done. All the parts are done. Here's one last look at it, still all broken down. This old plane is ready to be put back together and taken for a test drive. And there's an old plane that's fitting to take home to Mother. While she may not be perfect, I'd say it looks a whole lot better than it did when we started. We're going to get a look at her from every angle. Cleaned up like she is, the loss of nickel isn't quite as bad as what I thought it was going to be. There are clearly spots of nickel missing here and there, but overall she cleaned up pretty darn good. The fence is tight when it's locked in place. It swings freely when it's not locked. Nothing left to do but to take her for a test drive. I'll be using some 3/4 of an inch thick walnut for the test drive. And the first cut we'll be making will be the tongue, so the fence is in this position right here. For cutting both the tongue and the groove, the irons are pressed all the way against the center of the frame. Time to see what she'll do. Oh, that's nice. There's some shavings for the wig. So we keep on doing this until the plane bottoms out. And that's how you know that your tongue is done. Tell you what, I couldn't imagine doing the floor for the entire house, but I think I'm getting close to finishing this tongue. One more pass. Tongue is done. Now it's time to switch the fence over to cut the groove. That's it. Locked in place, ready to go. I am in the groove today. This seems to be working fine too. No changes to the settings. Just flip the fence around and ready to cut a groove. Just like the tongue, I'm going to continue to cut the groove until this plane bottoms out and stops cutting on its own. I think I'm getting close. Starting to skip. A little bit more. Oh Yeah, I think so far it's passed the test. We're going to find out when we fit these two pieces together. But first, here's a look at the spoils. Definitely some good wig making material there. And here's a look at the end result. Tongue and groove is done. Didn't have to do anything weird to make it work. And here's a look at what I ended up with. And now it would be safe to say that she passed the test. And Darren, I want to thank you for your service to our country. This old plane is yours. She is a beautiful old Stanley number 48. I hope you enjoy it. The only thing I ask is that the first project you make is your very first wood wig. And you can enter it in the contest I'm going to be doing sometime soon. So go ahead and do that. Take some pictures of the process. Take a picture of you at the end showing me you wearing your wig. And you might be the first one in that contest. But everybody else, that's it for today. Another great project done. Hope you liked the video. Look to the pile to see what's next. But until then, time for supper. Bye.